W tej części będziemy mieć 4 prelegentów, a rozpoczynamy od wystąpienia pani Agaty Nguyen Chong, która jest absolwentką Royal College of Art i badaczką związaną z Foresting Architecture, organizacją zajmującą się informowaniem o przemocy państwowej i korporacyjnej przy pomocy wizualizacji i nowych technologii. O wykorzystanych w organizacji procesach i o tym, czym pani Agata zajmuje się w tej przestrzeni, opowie nam na wykładzie Odziedziczone świadectwa i przywrócenie dowodów. Refleksje na temat przemocy środowiskowej i kolonialnej. Pani Agato, serdecznie zapraszam na scenę. Niczego nie ruszałam, więc powinno być okej.
Pięknie przetłumaczone. Dzień dobry. Jestem z Polski, urodziłam się w Warszawie, ale przeprowadzę prezentację po angielsku, żeby nie kaleczyć naszej pięknej polszczyzny za bardzo. Thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Agata, and I'm a researcher with Forensic Architecture, a research agency based in London that uses spatial and media analysis to uncover evidence of state and corporate violence against individuals, communities, and the environment. We are an interdisciplinary group operating across human rights, architecture, journalism, art, academia, and the law. The agency has been described to have co-created an entire new academic field and an emergent media practice. Our investigations employ various spatial analysis techniques, digital modeling, synchronization of footage, photogrammetry, immersive game engine models to reconstruct incidents of human rights violations. We investigate states and corporate entities, including militaries, police forces, government agencies, and companies, for their violent acts, including repressive policing, civilian deaths and conflict, structurally racist policymaking, violence against migrants and refugees, and historical and contemporary colonial violence, including the destruction of environments and life worlds. These are the themes that I'm going to focus on today, as this is what I've mostly been focused on during my time at FA so far. That is colonial violence and its entanglement with environmental violence. The word forensic is derived from the Latin forensis, meaning pertaining to the forum. The Roman Forum was a space of public politics, law and economy combined, but the meaning of the word has shifted since then. While police forensics today reinforce the power of states, forensic architecture, as we understand it, is a civilian counter-forensic practice that inverts the hegemonic gaze back onto the states and brings evidence of their crimes against citizens to the surface. In the pursuit of accountability, we seek to work across various forums, from courts of law, parliamentary inquiries, citizens' tribunals, international media, and exhibitions, probably most notably for us. Each of these forums has its own potential benefits, but also limitations. In courts, we struggle for the admissibility of citizen-produced digital evidence. In cultural institutions, we employ art as an investigative and political medium, transforming the gallery into a space for seeking accountability. And in one such case, very recently, as part of our long-term Namibia project that I will speak about later, we organized an event at the House of World Cultures in Berlin last December, where we endeavored not only to present the investigation in this public space, but also to transform this forum in the process. The event was called Inherited Testimonies, and together with our Namibian partners, the descendants of the genocide survivors, we delivered a live performance presentation of our findings from the fieldwork that we conducted earlier in the year. Their testimonies, therefore, were delivered as an act of collective reconstruction around this large curved screen of the environment as a form of world building and navigating within it. Contesting the Western legal contexts in which testimony is understood as an institutionally regulated act, the event was a form of immersive, situated, and transgenerational testimony delivered with other people. And so forensic architecture is not just the name of our agency, it's also a wider term to understand the wider field of practice that has developed around this type of work, which encompasses the production and presentation of spatial evidence within legal, political, cultural contexts. And it takes architecture to include not only buildings, the built environment, but shaped environments as a whole at the scale of cities and territories. At its core, this practice relies on its collaborative networks and the grounded, lived experience of those at the forefront of struggle. The task of civilian investigation is to collect, process, and understand the story that weaves all these images, these pieces of footage, together. In this case of the Israeli bombing of Gaza in 2014, the team obtained hundreds of videos from one single day. They are what first seems like chaotic images of smoke and rubble, but you would notice quickly that each smoke cloud effectively acts as a clock. It registers the information about time. Even though the images are often sourced on social media where we don't have the metadata anymore, the smoke clouds allow us to synchronize the footage in time and space. And so by using this technique of geolocation and 3D modeling, we could begin synchronizing all of this footage in time and space, what we often refer to as photo matching. But it's, of course, by photos. We also very often mean videos. This process allows us to reference different locations of bombardment in a model that basically helps us understand the individual perspectives that saw the events unfold. In what you see here, we often refer to it as an image complex. So a web, a weave of reality that becomes a crowdsourced evidence where we can tap into people's views and and the way they witnessed an event. It's important to understand that states have asymmetrical access to information and means of investigation that they use to obscure and manufacture narratives in their favor. Their resources give an illusion of authority over truth that in effect imposes a kind of monopoly on truth in the way they use their claims. Civilian investigations are inquiries with lesser means and sources, but these reconstructed 3D or cartographic environments can often constitute a common base through which interdisciplinary experts can analyze and understand events and patterns of violence. What you see on the screen here is the work that is currently being conducted within our office on the assault on the genocide taking place in Gaza right now, and this current research into the war crimes being committed by Israel there has been referenced in legal reports. For instance, the report submitted by the South African legal team at the International Court of Justice, and also referenced by Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur, among other experts. This work that is currently being developed with a large team that is studying the consequences of weaponizing humanitarian violence and humanitarian strategies by the Israeli army in order to displace Gazans. What I'm going to focus on now is an investigation that FA started working on in early 2022 about the first genocide of the 20th century perpetrated by Imperial Germany against the Ova Herero and Nama people in what is in our modern day Namibia, back then was called German Southwest Africa, the German colony. And so we started working. We were invited by a group, a legal team called European Center for Constitutional Human Rights. They're based in Berlin. In order to work with them and communities on the ground, the survivors, the descendants of the survivors of this genocide, which happened between 1904 and 1908, in order to produce a body of visual evidence on this long overlooked, long ignored genocide. And we worked first, in the first phase of this research, with a group called Ova Herero Genocide Foundation. More recently, we worked we focused on the Nama people, on the experience of the Nama people with the Nama Traditional Leaders Authority. And our research began really by looking at the photographic record that is available. We had to deal a lot with colonial archival collections, and we very quickly noticed that these archives are a very partial view, a partial perspective of the events that took place. And there is a certain kind of violence that is being still perpetrated until today in these collections. Because this type of representation, this type of photography fragments the life worlds of indigenous people that are represented in these photographs. They're represented as part of the landscape in a kind of state of nature, appealing to the colonial imaginary, kind of making it seem that, oh, this territory, it's ripe for taking. It's land that needs to be cultivated. It needs to be colonized. This was all part of the Imperial German narrative and what was then being developed as this Ratzelian concept of Lebensraum, living space, right? Of course, I'm sure everyone here knows what happens 30 years later. After these events, Namibia, the genocide that was perpetrated in Namibia essentially constituted a testing ground for all of these ideas that would later be transplanted in Eastern Europe. I'm going to now talk about the most recent investigation that we released, and that is about the Holmkrantz massacre, which actually predates the official date of the genocide. I just said started in 1904. For the Nama people, the genocide started here in 1893, so more than a decade preceding the official time frame of this genocide. It's a little studied, long overlooked early colonial massacre, during which the Nama were displaced from a place they inhabited called Holmkrantz, and it's known as the Holmkrantz massacre. Very little evidence survives about Holmkrantz today. It's a private farm today, it belongs to one owner. One needs to make a private arrangement to even enter. And this is in part due to the totality of destruction by the Germans that occurred on that day, on the 12th of April, 1893. But it's also a testament to the Witbooi Nama, that's the subtribe that lived there, to their steadfast resistance to being documented by the colonial regime. And actually, the first time this place is mapped is in 1892, 6 months before the massacre takes place. Before then, the Germans weren't able to map this location simply because of the way, the semi-nomadic way the Nama lived. And what we see here in this map from the end of 1892, we see here already Holmkrantz being mapped with its, being called by its German name, Germanized name, instead of its indigenous original name. And we see that this very act of mapping essentially prefigures the massacre to come less than a year later. That this very act of cartographic representation already renders the violence visible in a sense. It's also labeled in this German map as proposed crown land before the massacre and the onslaught even takes place. And so, together with descendants, during our field work, we obviously visited the place, the farm, and conducted our usual kind of site documentation. And we went there with descendants who told us about the entire location. But what we also did, and often do in cases like this, is we applied our method that we refer to as situated testimony. This is a technique that forensic architecture has developed for reconstructing scenes of violence, spaces where some traumatic event took place, with the witnesses of an event. This is something that very notably was used, for instance, to model a prison in Syria, where prisoners were blindfolded and actually had to recreate the space only through sound. In this case, we had to also transform this technique because obviously we're not working with direct eyewitnesses of these events because they're so far removed in time. So in this investigation, we worked with descendants who still knew so much about what occurred and about how people lived back then, thanks to the rich oral tradition that is carried through generations. And thanks to this oral history that we were listening to, we were attuned to, we were able to reconstruct the settlement of the Wybory Nama before the massacre, the way they lived at this site prior to the attack. We were sat in a room in a little community center with a few elders and a historian who described detail by detail all these elements of an individual household, how far apart the houses would be, what kind of material culture and traditional practices related to the river and fire they used and practiced. And through this attention to the detail, we began weaving more detail into this inhabitation that until now has not been represented. This is something really important. We don't have any visual representation. We don't have any visual record of how the Nama there lived prior to the attack. And we never ask about these kind of traumatic details directly, right? While the project is about a massacre that unfolds within one night, what we do always first is we reconstruct and furnish sort of the surroundings in which the violence takes place. Through this process, which requires us to listen carefully and learn together with the descendants about what matters to us, we develop this understanding of how to read the ground for potential traces of houses. By asking Zach, this was the name of our rememberer, by asking him, are you happy with the texture of the stone, of the rock that's in our model right now? Only by asking that question, he was actually able to tell me that, well, what are these empty spots? These are the places that you should be putting the houses in, because this is how people would put a floor and clear this area out of larger rocks in order to put their house on a stable, flat foundation. And so there's this process of reciprocal kind of exchange in how we interview the witnesses or descendants in this case, and they're able to tell us details and important information that otherwise, if we asked them directly, they wouldn't have been able to tell us. So this reconstruction of the settlement of the Nama at Holmkrans essentially took place starting from those locations that we identified during the situated testimony. We were then able to determine for the first time the probable extent of how big the settlement could have been based on closely tracing the elements of the topography, looking at the details that the archaeological remains that are still there, determining the full extent and the number of people and houses that may have been there. And our reconstruction is essentially, it aims to underscore the vitality of oral tradition in this case, in the act of reconstituting this colonial archive, and it testifies to the oral transmission of knowledge as an ongoing act of resistance in itself. What you see here on the screen is this reconstruction of the settlement, the end result of it, that is essentially the most complete reconstruction of the settlement to date. We use a software called Unreal Engine, which is a game engine, but we repurpose it to create these immersive scenes, and it also allows us to quite realistically render the environment, all of the foliage and trees and grass. What do we often do? This is the only photo of Honkrans already after the attack. We can see the Nama settlement entirely erased. What we see is 2 soldiers, perhaps, and a building that was built by the Germans afterwards. What we do often is work at the threshold of resolution of the material we work with. In the case of footage from social media, it often comes, quite compressed. In this case, with the old photographs, in this case it was a screen print, the resolution of things actually, this threshold of the resolution hides important details about things. And we noticed here in this image on the very edge, a little darker spot that then we corroborated to be the same location of this building that we placed earlier, based on the foundations that we saw during our field trip on site, the foundations of this church that the Vidboy Nama built there. And alongside this entire spatial reconstruction of the settlement and the unfolding of the massacre, we also interrogated the environmental changes that have ensued since the expulsion of the Nama from this land. Of course, we don't have satellite imagery dating back to the time. The oldest aerial photo that we could find was from 1967 of this area. So we used it as our, kind of last, as the source that is sort of halfway through in time between the event that we're talking about and today. So we tracked the change in vegetation that occurred between now and 67 first. We went through this process of classification, as it's referred to often in GIS and Geographic Information System work. So we classified these black and white pixels, the grain, into these distinct categories of grass, bush cover, so like woody vegetation, and bare ground. And we run a similar process. This happens using an algorithm. And we then also define the categories by comparing what kind of level of gray corresponds to bush, for instance. And we run a similar process on a contemporary satellite image. And in this process, we saw a very dramatic increase of woody vegetation in this area, just within this period between 67 and 21. And you'd think that's kind of like a good thing, right? More trees, more bush in this case, so smaller woody shrubs. But it actually points to a phenomenon that is referred to as bush encroachment. So in this process of replacing a grassy savanna type cover, we see these woody species outcompeting the grass species, meaning, for instance, during periods of drought, woody vegetation has a much higher advantage of surviving. So this process of bush encroachment is actually a symptom of land degradation, very severe land degradation, and this phenomenon is unfortunately very rife across Namibia today. And in order to understand these environmental changes better that have happened between 1893 and today, we wanted to reconstruct the vegetation cover at the time of this attack. And for that, we really had to just defer to the oral history transmitted by the Nama descendants with whom we were working. Of course, it's a very different kind of resolution that we get. We don't have this kind of top-down view and every single tree or bush represented in the form of a pixel, but what we get is a much more grounded perspective. They're able to tell us details of how, grass was so abundant back in those days that, for instance, little children would disappear because it was so long, or that people wouldn't be afraid to burn the grass at the end of dry season. And that was actually a process that further enriched the fertility of the soil, a controlled burn. This practice completely disappeared once the colonial occupation of land takes over. And so, of course, this is a kind of approximation, but thanks to this reconstruction from oral history, we are able to get some kind of idea of how much the environment has changed since then, how entire ecologies are being obliterated and exacerbated really by these colonial land use practices such as overgrazing. The idea of private property itself hardened with the architecture of fences that does not anymore enable wild animals to roam through the landscape uninterrupted. Overhunting, also decimating populations of game in this area. All of this has devastating consequences for the biodiversity of these grassy savannas that the Nama relied on in their subsistence, and of course, huge populations of flora and fauna. And so, tracing this environmental change in Honkrans supports these observations made by the affected communities across wide stretches of Namibia, not just the Nama people, who claim that the change in land use patterns by German colonial powers has begun a process that led to the loss of the region's biodiversity and is now leading to desertification. So with this project, we're essentially trying to offer a new precedent for formerly colonized peoples affected by genocide and climate breakdown today to pursue initiatives of public education and restorative justice. Its deep collaborative fabric and community-led approach envisions new approaches to a transnational culture of remembrance and new propositions for meaningful reparation, rooted in awareness, acknowledgement, preservation, and restitution. This project is still ongoing, and we are going to release another stage of it in a couple of months. That is essentially, it's a reconstruction of a concentration camp that was established by the Germans on an island called Shirk Island. And the theme there is about how the environment of this very severe, of this island that's in a very severely windy and cold region of Namibia was actually weaponized to create this almost like natural concentration camp where a lot of the very traumatic, a lot of the techniques that were later used in concentration camps in Europe were first tested there. Right now, I'm going to speak a bit more about another recent project, very quickly. This is a release building on a phase previous investigation into herbicidal warfare and its effects on Palestinian farmers in the occupied Gaza Strip. And this investigation examines the systematic targeting of orchards and greenhouses by Israeli forces since October 2023. And this analysis essentially reveals that this destruction is not only widespread, it's also deliberate. It's a deliberate act of ecocide that has been exacerbated by the ongoing famine. And it's also a part of a wider pattern of deliberately depriving Palestinians of critical resources for survival. So the team here has conducted this reconstruction of a specific orchard of the Abu Safia family, and it shows we do this kind of cartographic regression method quite often just to see very simple kind of, comparison of before and after certain events using satellite imagery. We see here this ground invasion, uprooting an orchard and building all this military kind of earthworks on top of it. This investigation, it's important to mention, it builds on existing collaborations with local farmers and agricultural workers in Gaza. And the analysis shows that this ground invasion that has advanced over nearly 50% of Gazan farms and orchards in remote sensing, using remote sensing, which is basically using satellite data to visualize and render phenomena often across quite wide kind of light spectrums. Here we do study that's referred to as vegetation index, showing healthy and destroyed vegetation. It's an indicator of health and robustness of plant life. We're actually able to see that in this comparison that as of March 2024, last month, of all of the agricultural areas targeted, approximately 40% of the land in Gaza previously used for food production has been destroyed. I'll end here because I think we're over time, but I just wanted to maybe on a final note say that this destruction of agricultural land and infrastructure in Gaza is a deliberate act of ecocide and a critical dimension of Israel's genocidal campaign. The targeted farms are fundamental to local food production, and the effects of this systematic agricultural destruction are only exacerbated by other deliberate acts of deprivation of critical resources for Palestinian survival. And these acts include the famine that I've mentioned before, but also the obstruction of humanitarian aid destined for Gaza and the destruction of medical infrastructure and other civilian infrastructure. Thank you.